Unity, belonging, meaning. As their influence wanes, so these other more toxic forces come in to fill the vacuum. And I think that's what we see. I mean, you saw it last year, really unpleasant episode with Sir Roger Scruton, the Conservative philosopher who had been appointed to this government commission called Building Better, Building Beautiful. And it was a commission that had been appointed by, I think, the Department for Communities and Local Government to try and find out ways in which we could make public housing more attractive. And he'd written, numerous books on aesthetics, on architecture, as well as on conservative politics. And a journalist took him out to lunch. A journalist he had good reason to think would be fair-minded and decent, because it was from a magazine that he had written a column for a few years before, and interviewed him. And then after the interview, took various things he'd said out of context, dug up some of the more inflammatory things he'd said in the past, and took them out of context, and painted this picture of Sir Roger Scruton as this kind of frothing at the mouth, kind of bug-eyed homophobe and anti-Semite, which was wildly inaccurate, bore no relation to the truth. It was all created by twisting what he'd said, both in this interview and in the past, by this sort of mischievous journalist. And even before the interview itself was published in the magazine, the journalist just put a few choice quotes on Twitter. Roger Scruton had been tossed under a bus by the government, and that was by a Conservative government. It took Douglas Murray, one of the directors of the Free Speech Union, and others. I played a small part, but journalists kind of looked at the way in which these things he'd said had been taken out of context. Douglas got hold of the full transcript of the interview and discovered just how his words had been twisted and distorted, was able to print the transcript of that interview, and eventually, after several months, the magazine in question issued an apology. They didn't actually sack the journalist, but he got demoted, and eventually he was reinstated to this government body. But to see a man like that, that was in the last year of his life. He was 75, and had devoted his life to education. In the 1970s and 80s, he worked behind the Iron Curtain to set up a kind of underground university, so dissidents in places like Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia could have access to the books that were banned in their countries. He'd risked his liberty in order to provide an education to people behind the Iron Curtain in extremely dangerous circumstances. He's been, showered with honours by Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia now. But to see a man like that, a man as distinguished as that, torn limb from limb by the digital mob, I mean, it was just awful. And in the last year of his life, shortly after he just about managed to put this episode behind him, he was diagnosed with cancer and died about 3 months later. Just awful.